Okay, so we're going to start talking about Kosev in the hospital, writing in the hospital. Obviously, this lends itself to a lot of different discussions. The entire sugya of Kosev is a big one, but we're going to try to deal with some of the basic things that come up in a hospital, some of the basic topics that a physician would have to deal with when they find themselves in the hospital and when they would have to take records. And obviously, this sugya, the discussion in general of writing on Shabbos, has taken on a very different form ever since hospitals more and more are shifting to digital records for a lot of different things. Obviously, it depends on the hospital as to how digital everything is and what exactly the system is. But obviously, there's a lot less in the general world, and for sure in hospital, there's a lot less actual handwriting going on. So that obviously makes a big difference in the sugya. So this is an important topic to think about and to discuss, and we're going to jump right in. I just sent out the Makoros to the WhatsApp groups, to Einstein and the JPN. So, and to the Shabbos in the hospital group. Everyone has access to that. I have been asked for follow-ups for people who are listening to the recordings about the Mar Makomos. So you could check those chats for the Makoros if anyone wants to see, because we're going to be following that. So let's just start. So it's mentioned the very first source that I sent out, the very first source, it mentions that Kosev is one of the 39 malachos. The Mishnah in Shabbos says, when it lists all the Avos malachos, it says HaKosev Shtei Osios. One of the malachos of Shabbos is writing two letters, and we're going to get back to exactly what the definition of writing is. Is it just that, or is it more? That's obviously brought a lot with the malacha of mochek, of erasing that in order to write. We're not going to really be dealing with erasing, but those are generally come hand in hand. And where did the malacha of Kosev come up? Where did that come up in the Mishkan? So Rashi on the spot points out that Kosev came up, Shayosim B'kar Sheyam Mishkan. What they would do is they would write on the beams in the Mishkan. When they would take it apart, Mipnei Shemafarkin also, they would take apart the beams when they would leave a certain place in the Mishkan, they would take apart the Mishkan and they would take apart the beams, and then Kaimuhu, and when they would put it back, Lo Yichafu Seder HaKrashim. They would want to mark off the beams so that they would know where to reattach it next time that they put the Mishkan back on. So they would write in the Mishkan, and that's where this came up, the malacha of Kosev. They would again mark off, they would write the markings on the krushim, on the pillars in the Mishkan, and that's where it came up. So what exactly is the Hagdara? How would we define the Malacha of Kosev? So the Mishnah says in Shabbos again, the Mishnah says HaKosev on the third source on the sheet, HaKosev Shtei Osios Be'elam Echad Chayev. So someone who writes two letters, we're not going to deal with Be'elam Echad right now, but in one swoop, in one thought, they're going to be Chayev. So what does that mean? So what does it entail? Kosev B'dio, B'sam, B'sikra. So if you write with all these different types of ink, if you wrote with ink or with paint or with a certain red pigment, bekumus, v'kankantum, v'kol davar shu roshim, with all these different, in all these different manners that leave a lasting mark. B'kol davar shu roshim al shnei, and then we'll stop there. So if you write with something that leaves a lasting mark, and then we could go on to the next bold kasab. But if kasab b'mashkin, b'mei peros, b'avak drachim, b'avak asofrim. But if you write with certain fruit juices or with dust or other things, b'kol davar she'ena miskayim pater. So if it's something that doesn't last, if it's an ink, if it's a writing implement that doesn't last, then you're going to be pater. And la'achar yado baraglo b'piv marpiko. And if you write with the back of your hand, with your foot, with your mouth, or with your elbow, all those things are going to be pater. So we're going to get back to all these things, but this seems to be the definition of writing on Shabbos, that you need to write with something that's miskayim. You need to write with something that lasts, something that's permanent. Again, we're going to have to get back to what exactly does lasting mean? What exactly is that hagdara? What is the exact parameters of permanent? We're going to get back to, and we're going to get back to soon. Is a computer permanent? Is writing on a computer permanent? Is a pencil permanent? Maybe you could say a pencil, since it could be erased, is impermanent. One of the, I guess, a good example is that a lot of us know people who are going to camp now. Younger kids are going to camp now and are labeling their shirts. And when people label their shirts, you notice that a year before, perhaps, when they went to camp, they labeled their shirts then, and then it faded. So would we say that the original label from a year ago before the summer that wasn't really a good writing because it wasn't miskayim, it didn't last forever? Would we say that? Or no, because the shirt is meant to be put in the laundry and then fade, etc. So what exactly would we say? Or would we say that writing on the mirror or a car door when it gets foggy, would that be considered writing? All these things are discussions in the poskim, and it all revolves around this idea of davar she'enu miskayim is pater, something that's not permanent, something that doesn't last is pater. The Rambam adds another thing in his halacha, which is intuitive. He says, "Eina kosev chayv ad sheyeto b'davar haroshem." It needs to be. He quotes this Gemara. He quotes this Mishnah that it needs to be that you're only chayav in kosev when it's with a writing implement that is miskayim, that lasts. But also he adds, I'm skipping a little bit towards the end of that line, v'yichtov al davar shemiskayim haksav alav. It needs to be written on something that also could be permanent, kigon, or v'klaf v'niyar, something like skin, or it would be on, on a klaf, on the stuff that we write tefillin and mezuzahs on, or it would be on paper, or on eights, or on wood. V'kayotzi behem. It needs to be on something. It needs to be on a thing that is also lasting. It needs to be writing with something that makes a mark, and also on a material which will last, that the Rambam had. So both of those things are necessary. Again, and we're going to get back to what exactly would miskayim mean, and that's a lot of the discussions. But before that, before we discuss, we get to all those things about disappearing ink and all these other potential things, or computers, or all the things that come up, and whether that's miskayim, we have to discuss some other basic concepts in the Malacha of Kosev. And in order to do so, let's assume you need to write for someone. Let's just give a test case. You need to write for someone. Let's say it's back in the day, and you don't have the option, let's say, of disappearing ink, or you don't have digital forms or something. I actually found online that one of the hospitals in New York, I'm sure there are many, but a hospital in New York, there was an article that they were implementing EMR, their electronic medical records, in January 2025. So that's pretty recent, which seems to indicate in December of 2024, if you were in Olin General Hospital, a couple hours away in New York, then and you need to give the patient an urgent surgery, because of, let's say, the patient has an urgent matter, he has a hematoma, a subdural hematoma, a collection of blood that accumulates between the brain and the inner layer of tissue, whatever it is, and it's something that's obviously urgent, and you need to sign along with the patient. You need to sign a consent form before this urgent surgery. Again, let's assume there's no disappearing ink, there's no electronic option, any of that. So how do you make this less severe? How would we deal with this case? How would we go about writing? How could we, again, something that we discussed, how could we bump it down from being an Isser D'Oraisa to a D'Rabbanan, or being a worse, or being a better D'Oraisa, perhaps? How do we bump it down? Or we could give maybe a less pasha case if someone's doing rounds in the ICU, maybe a nurse, and they have to take vitals every 4 hours, and someone who's in the ICU, probably they're chol sheyesh bo sakana. Again, all these concepts we discussed in the second round of this series. Please go back and look at that. That's always important chazara. That's why we did that first, just to know what a different chola is. Again, not all sick people are created equal. Not even everyone in the hospital is created equal. But assuming this person is a chol sheyesh bo sakana, which you could obviously violate a lot more than other things, but their vitals are the exact same as 4 hours ago. So how would they go about putting that down? Would that be necessary? It seems to be that would still be necessary to take down. And I put on this sheet, although the full discussion, really you could go back in the series and listen to that. We did say that osim, we'll just see the bold here in the mechaber, very important Shulchan Aruch that we've seen in the past, that osim lokol sheragilin lasos b'chol. That in that second case, when you're taking vitals, you have to do everything that's normal, the normal standard of care that you would do for this patient, the chol sheyesh bo sakana. You would do anything that you would do for them on a regular Tuesday. Again, as the Mishnah Berurah explains, even though you would think this isn't necessarily directly helping the patient, but since it has some sort of tzorech, since it has some sort of need, you would still have to do this act. You would still have to go about performing this this treatment, or taking down this piece of information for this patient. Rav Asher Weiss likes the concept of pikuach nefesh for Rabbim, that maybe for this person you don't need it, but for the Rabbim in general, in the broader scheme, you would. It's hard to wrap one's head around that, but I know in discussing recently with my Rabbi Rav Bednarsh about some of these concepts, it's clear that even though pikuach nefesh for Rabbi might be true, that something that's a standard form of care, if it makes sense and there's a reason why why it was set up that way to take vitals in this way and to make sure to take it down, then obviously it could lead to a situation where it's a problem if you don't take it down. So all these cases are cases where you would have to write or you would have to record this. So how would we bump it down? Again, from a classic case of Kosev, from a classic case of an Issa D'Oraisa, which obviously we would rather not violate because, as we already discussed as well, even when you can violate a D'Oraisa, it's still very much ideal, Kol she'efshar, as much as we can, to be Mishana, we should. So just to go through very quickly some of the Hagdaras, and through that we'll see some of the parameters of Kosev Midoraisa, and through that we'll see how to bump it down. So first is the quantity, the amount of letters. This came up in the very first source, the amount that you have to write. The Mishnah Berurah really gives a great summary in Siman Shin Mem of the Malacha of Kosev, because it's very limited in the Shulchan Aruch. But so the Mishnah Berurah records, based on a lot of the earlier Rishonim and the Mishnah and Gemara, that he writes, Ena Kosev Chayev, the third to last source on the first page, Ena Kosev Chayev Chatas Ad Yichtov Shtei Osios, that you're only going to be Chayev Mitoraisa for Kosev until you write two letters. Avalim Kosev Osa Achas, but it's important to note that if you only write one letter, then you're going to be patur from Kosev, but you might still be over on a Doraisa because of Chatzi Shir, which is beyond the scope of this Shir because you did something halfway. You did partly in Isser Doraisa because you are writing, let's assume in the normal way, but you're only writing one, if you're only writing one letter, so you might not be over on Melechas Shabbos, which is much more chamer, much more strict, but you might be over on Chatzi Shir, which is its own. It comes up a lot when you eat on Yom Kippur or eating chametz. Let's say you ate less than the shir. Is that totally mutter? Is it aser? Perhaps it's an independent isser or just a lower level of the original isser, whatever it is. So it still might be aser, but it's obviously one step down. So if there's a way to get around writing two full letters, then that might be one way to do it. So one of the hagdaras is quantity. It needs to be two letters or two symbols. People discuss, but for now we're just going to deal with two letters. The second Agdara that comes up is, and this is extremely controversial, as we'll see in a second, but the last source quotes the Ramah, who says that, and it's in the context of the Shulchan Aruch discussing what you could do on Shabbos actually in order to acquire a house, acquire a place in Eretz Yisrael. We have some heterim for Yishuv Eretz Yisrael in order to live in Eretz Yisrael. So the Ramah points out that you would be able perhaps to sign on Shabbos for that. There would be certain heterim to sign on Shabbos for a house in Eretz Yisrael, as the Rama points out, because biksav shelahem in the bold de'eno aser rak d'Rabbanan, because writing in non-Hebrew might only be a d'Rabbanan, and that's quoting the Or Zarua. So the Rama and the Or Zarua hold that writing not in Hebrew would only be a d'Rabbanan. Now this is extremely controversial, as I mentioned. And a lot of poskim really slam this. The Mishnah Berurah says already on the top of the second page. The Mishnah Berurah says that he says v'ayim beber alacha shebiarnu de das or zaru das echidahi. This is really a das yachid. This is really not a common psak of the poskim and of Chazal. Ve'in lo shum makom b'shas v'kol poskim v'kol poskim cholkim al zeh, and everyone disagrees. And this is a crazy psak. The svirle da'ap b'ksav shelahemu isim midoraisa. He says the standard psak is that even in English or any other language, it's asim midoraisa, and v'kol lashon, and the Aruch HaShulchan says even stronger. He thinks it's an avla. It's totally problematic that this psak has become widespread, that people think it would be less of an Isser D'Oraisa to write in any other language. The Aruch HaShulchan says it's a total mistake, and it's a big problem. So definitely the standard psak is that even writing in English would certainly be Asr D'Oraisa, but this is out there, and it is quoted as a potential snif l'hakel. Again, if you really need to write, it is quoted as a potential snif l'hakel. Rav Avadia mentions it in Chilek Gimel Simin Chav Gimel as a potential heter, and I put on the sheet in Minchas Shlomo when he discusses the disappearing ink, which we'll get to in a minute. The Minchas Shlomo and Rav Shlomo Zalman already points out in a passing way that one could perhaps be mitzaref, one could perhaps use this as an additional snif l'hakel. He says, "We came to need done hu le'inyan ksav lo azi," even for this for our issue in the disappearing ink, he mentions the fact that in most cases we're not dealing with Hebrew writing, and even so, even if it is Hebrew writing, it's going to be in Hebrew script, and it's not going to be in Ksav Ashuris, the actual original Sefer Torah writing with as the Magen, and he quotes the Magen Avraham, which we're not going to read inside in the next source, who discuss that if the writing is lacking the tagin, is lacking the little crowns on top of the writing, which seems to indicate that script writing wouldn't be the same level of Isser. But again, this really is not the standard psak, but the Minchas Shlomo does quote it in Nishmas Avram, and Dr. Abraham does use it as a potential heter as well in cases of need. So this is out there in theory. Again, although this is definitely not the standard psak, it is used as a theoretical heter. The fact that it wouldn't be in Hebrew, which is obviously the case in America or even in Israel, if someone were writing in script, Rosh Shlomo Zalman and Nishmas Avram point out. Uh, so. So that's another concept. That's number two. Number three is the way that it's performed. We already mentioned that quickly in the Mishnah, but the way that one writes would be another hagdara of this psak. So it says the Mishnah Brura, second to last source on the second page, Hakosev b'smo ola acher yado. So one who writes with his left hand or with the back of his hand, if there was a way to like put a pen in the back of your hand. That you kind of put behind your hand and you flip it around, whatever, you hold it backwards, or you hold it beraglov, bepiv, marpeko, you hold it in your foot, your mouth, or your elbow. So all those things are going to be pater if you write in that way, because this is a shino, this isn't the normal way of writing, and therefore these would only be an isser midrabanan. So although it would still obviously be Asr Midrabanan, still it would not be a Doraisa, and obviously he continues that a lefty, obviously it would be his right hand. And if you're ambidextrous, if you write well with both hands, then this psak would not apply to you because really both of them are your dominant hand. And if you're comfortable writing with both, that would be an important point. That would be obviously not a heter. And an important point needs to be made here, which is that it's true that this is a psak for Kosev, that writing in the abnormal way, in this case with your left hand, would be able to bump it down to a derabanan, but that's not the case with all the malachos. That not all malachos are created equal when it comes to shinoi. Absolutely not. Carrying, for example, if someone were carrying in Rosh Hashanah with their left hand, that may very well be the same Isser Doraisa carrying with your left hand. When it comes to certain malachos, shinoi is really case specific. So if I were carrying something again, I'm a righty. If I were carrying with my left hand, that would still be Aser. But when it comes to writing specifically, it would be mutter at least midoraisa. And again, even though it might have a similar outcome, it doesn't necessarily mean I saw some things, some people struggling with this issue. I saw printed that it's not necessarily about the outcome, even if, let's say, it's your non-dominant hand, but it could come out very clearly. Some people's left-hand writing might be better than a lot of people's right-hand writing. For sure, doctors who have terrible handwriting, that very well could be the case, and that's very possible that it would be the case. Nevertheless, it's not necessarily about the outcome of the malacha, which may, again, look fine and look the same, but it really is just the way the malacha is performed, and therefore it would be derabanan if you could do it with your left hand. So obviously that would be a good eitzah for someone again who needs to write by hand. There's no other options, no digital, no disappearing ink, none of this. So writing with your left hand would be a good example. The Nishmas Avram, Dr. Abraham quotes in Siman Shin Mem in an additional eitzah, perhaps another shinoi, which is using fingers without your thumb. And he mentions that the Rav Neubert, the Shmir Shabbat Kehilchasa, agreed to him that using your fingers, that writing without the thumb may also be a shinoi for writing. So again, with your left hand, and if you can't do that, using without your thumb could be a good eitzah. So doing it in a different way would be another eitzah. Good. So that is the third understanding of the Hagdara of Kosev and how you could potentially bump it down. Good. So moving along to moving along. So let's get down to the big hack about writing, which are the more common um, discussions, at least for doctors, when it comes to writing, which are what are other potential options, what are other eitzes to get out of the isser of Kosev. Again, we mentioned using a shinoi, which might not always be practical. Obviously, would only be a thing if you could be mishana. Obviously, if there's an urgent matter that needs to be signed, let's say before an urgent surgery, a consent form, and you're fumbling around with your left hand to keep dropping the pen, and it's an urgent surgery, obviously that's a non-starter. But if it's something that, again, in the vast majority of cases, as I've discussed with a lot of the people at Einstein, in the vast majority of cases where things aren't immediate or necessary in these types of things, perhaps you could do a shinoi would be prudent and would be possible and would not compromise patient care in any way, shape, or form. But so back to our discussion is what do we do with this concept of disappearing ink? Tzomet made this thing called the Shabbos pen or the Shabbat. I think that's a very cute name. Basically, it's a pen which disappears after a short amount of time. We'll get back to how useful that actually was. The Jewish Physicians Network also, you could look at their website. I just saw today they have a link to an Amazon thing called a sewing pen, which I didn't know existed until today. But it's a way to mark off your territory if you're sewing, and then it would go away after a certain amount of time. It's very unclear. I read some of the reviews. And some of them were that it disappears too quickly, so obviously it might not accomplish the same goal. But the goal is that someone on Shabbos, if they need to write down certain important information, that it would last just enough for after Shabbos, and then on Motzei Shabbos they would be able to copy it down in a permanent way, and in doing so, perhaps get out of this concept of miskayim. Perhaps they would be writing in a way that's not actually permanent, so therefore perhaps it could be bumped down. So what do we say? So what do we say about writing with disappearing ink? So first and foremost, it's important to note that that still would be aser midrabanan. The very last source on the second page, the Shulchan Aruch says even if you do write with juices or any of these things that aren't miskayim, still he says yesh lizar not to do that because it would still be aser midrabanan. And on top of page 3, Mishnah Berurah makes that clear. Even be'ina miskayim, it would still be aser midrabanan. So what is this miskayim a function of? What is this? Is this specifically a Kosev thing? So it doesn't seem to be that way. It doesn't seem to be unique necessarily to the concept of writing. It seems to be a function of melechas machsheves. The type of malacha that's asur on Shabbos is called melechas machsheves, and the Mishnah in discussing the malachos, it says Zaklal, the second source on the third page, Kol ha'osa malacha umalachto miskayemes b'Shabbos chayev. One who does a malacha, or all who do a malacha, and the malacha is miskayem b'Shabbos. We're not going to define that right now. They are going to be chayev. So that's what it says in the Mishnah. There's seems to be 3 approaches as to how to read that one seemingly simple line if it's miskayem on Shabbos. Again, all getting back to the question of what does that mean, miskayem? Mentioned at the very beginning, does that mean forever? Does that mean a minute? How long does miskayem mean? How long does it mean to be permanent, to be lasting? What exactly does that mean? So first you have Rashi, who reads this, and he says, Kol osim malachto sheyesh miskayemes kayotze bo ve'im mosif aleh. So Rashi seems to understand, what does that mean? Malachto miskayem Shabbos, that it's in its final stage. When you did this thing, when you did this malacha, we're obviously using writing as the example, it's in its final stage. The malacha and the work is done, and someone on a regular Tuesday would or could not actually add to this, and they would be finished with their job, even though in theory, within Rashi, even one could add to this. Uh, Nevertheless, there are people, and it is possible, it is at a stage where it could be left forever. So Rashi understands Miskayim, Kipshuto, as it's permanent. It could be left forever, and it's at its final stage. And the question is, what do you do with this word b'Shabbos in the Mishnah? Kol osim malachim miskayim es b'Shabbos chayev. So the reason why there are those who argue on Rashi, which we're going to see in one second, is because what do you do with this word b'Shabbos? And just to be clear, the Meiri makes it even clearer and says the same thing as Rashi, and he says that one would do exactly this and be able to do this without adding anything else, that this would be its final stage. So one approach is Rashi, that it would be permanent, kipshuto. It would be something that would be everlasting. Again, not lo'olam vad, not necessarily forever, but for a very, very long time. But the way the Rambam's colloquially understood, we could just read the bold. The Rambam, when he quotes this, he says, "V'kol she'im malachto miskayim is b'Shabbos pater." The Rambam says something that's not miskayim on Shabbos is pater. So how is this understood? The Sharatzian understands this as saying that what does miskayim mean? Does it have to be forever? Does it have to be for 2 weeks? For a month? No. It just has to be miskayim on Shabbos itself. Someone, if they were writing a certain ink, if they were writing on this disappearing ink, but the goal of the disappearing ink was at least to last till after Shabbos, it could be within the Rambam itself that it would still be asim midoraisa, because the Rambam says miskayim means bishabbos, and that's how he gets this word. Because otherwise, why would the Mishnah have this word bishabbos? Why would the Mishnah mention miskayim bishabbos? We know we're talking about Shabbos. It's a Mishnah in Shabbos. This whole Masechta is about Shabbos. Why would you have to mention the word bishabbos? And the Rambam, when he quotes this, the Sharatzian already points out that it must be that he's saying it has to be miskayim bishabbos. Otherwise, on Shabbos itself. Otherwise, this word is totally redundant. And the Sharatzian says, we'll just read the book. Mashma l'chora da'afilu miskayim es rak al yom haShabbos l'chud. Even if it's only miskayim on Shabbos itself, it would still be asim midoraisa. And therefore, the Sharatzian points out this machlokes between Rashi and the Rambam that the reason why any of these things that are not miskayim wouldn't work, the Sharatzian says within the Rambam, it must be, it's ena miskayim klala, afilu al yom haShabbos. So all these examples of things that aren't miskayim, fruit juices or other things, or dust, are only things that are miskayim maybe for a few moments, but wouldn't even last that one day on Shabbos. But nevertheless, he quotes Rashi as saying the exact opposite. It would have to be miskayim tamid, and it wouldn't be sufficient for one day. So this is a big machlokes Rambam Rashi. At least is understood by the Sharatzian and other Achronim, the Sharatzian being the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, that this is a machlokes. Again, what is miskayim? And obviously, there's a massive nafkamina for a lot of things, including disappearing ink. Disappearing ink, according to the Rambam, it doesn't disappear until after Shabbos. If it would accomplish that goal, it should still be asim midoraisa. And the Ritva even makes this point explicitly. It says Yeshe Pirshu that it would be sufficient to be Mekayim, that it would be Kayim only for Bo Bayom, only for that day on Shabbos. It would still be Chayav and still be Asim Midoraisa. So that is the second approach for what exactly Miskayim means, and he's quoting, this riff is coming from Yerushalmi, which talks about Bona from in the Mishkan, but we're not gonna go further in that. But the Ritva makes this even more explicit. But there's a third approach, which is the Rashba, which it seems from the Be'er Halacha and others that the Rashba seems to be the Derech HaMelech, at least that Rosh Shlomo Zalman and others take. Again, we'll get back to the disappearing ink, but the third approach is the Rashba, which seems to be a middle approach. And the Rashba, in dealing with this question and struggling with what exactly does Miskayim say, well, we could just read the bold. What does he say does Miskayim mean? He says, V'yesh lomer dimekayim iktsas, ad shedarkan shel b'nei adam lichtom behen dvarim she'enu asuin l'kayim le'olam elazman echad. He says that what does miskayim mean? Miskayim doesn't necessarily mean that they endure forever, like Rashi, but it also doesn't mean that it only endures, it's only miskayim for Shabbos itself. Rather, it endures somewhere in between. It endures somewhat, shedarkan shel b'nei adam lichtom behen dvarim, that people would commonly use this, and it would be miskayim for the amount of time that would be useful for people to write things that aren't necessarily meant to last forever, but would still be useful for a set period. It would be something that would be sufficient for a few days, for a certain period of time. And he gives example, kisifra as a chronos, like certain things for memory. That people would want to jot down a journal or a memory book or notes that people would take, that again they wouldn't need to necessarily set in stone and keep forever, but it's something that would still be useful again for a few days. V'hilkach le'inyan Shabbos, and he makes an important distinction. Le'inyan Shabbos melechas machshavas hi. For Shabbos, it would be sufficient for something to be around for a few days, for you to do a Kosev, for you to do a writing that would be miskayim, that would endure for a few days, aval inyan for this amount of time, for an amount of time that would be useful, a middle approach, aval inyan svarim, but for sifrei Torah, for example, or for gittin or something you need ksav, the be'inan davra miskayim la'olam, for those things you would need something that would be forever, similar to what Rashi understood for Shabbos. That, he said, hani lo mekaymi, that wouldn't be sufficient. So if you would want to write a sefer Torah in this type of ink, then for sure it wouldn't be sufficient in an ink that would go away after let's say 3-4 days, then that wouldn't work. But for Shabbos, he would say that would be asim midoraisa, and that's the approach of the Rashba, which again, Rosh Shlomo Zalman and other poskim seem to assume is the Derech HaMelech, is the best approach. So back to this discussion about disappearing ink. So first of all, the Minchas Yitzchak, as based on this Rambam that we saw, he says this disappearing ink or the Shab 8 of Tzomet would be Asmi Doraisa. For a few reasons, we're not going to read it inside, but first of all, he says the Rambam makes the most sense. It's the best pshat in the Mishnah. He explains the words clearly, so therefore the Rambam would say it's Asmi Doraisa. And he says the other Mefarshim even agree to the Rambam's psak, even if they have a different read of the Mishnah. And he actually has an interesting argument, which I think is fascinating. You could definitely argue on it, but it's a fascinating argument that even the Rashba, which he agrees makes seems to be compelling, even the Rashba would agree that disappearing pen would be usser because his point is that the isser is to have the writing last for a meaningful amount of time. And the whole idea here is that it should last. The whole idea of disappearing ink is that it should last until the physician could copy it down later, which is by definition a meaningful amount of time and a useful amount of time. Because again, the whole point is that it would only disappear after I wouldn't need it anymore. So he said even for the Rashba would be asmi doraisa. That's according to Minchas Yitzchak. That's according to Diane Weiss. And he says it would be asmi doraisa even to use this disappearing pen. Nevertheless, Rav Shlomo Zalman disagrees for a number of reasons. Again, a number of reasons. You could look. I put it on the sheet on page 4. We're not going to read it all inside, but he disagrees for a number of reasons. First of all, it's clear from the writing in the Mishkan that it needs to last and endure significantly longer than just a little bit or just a few days. And he even argues on that understanding in the Rambam. And if you read the Rambam carefully, and I put that Rambam on the bottom of page 4, if you read that Rambam carefully, then in Perek Yud Aleph Halacha Tes Vav, when the Rambam talks about something being miskayim in another place, and the ink that you need, and the halacha actually that we quoted earlier in the shir on the first page, the Rambam doesn't mention this very mechudesh understanding of it only needing to last on Shabbos. It says davar miskayim, it says something that lasts, and seemingly if you look at that, it seems it would have to last a long time. If it's Shabbos afternoon, and it's a short Shabbos, and it would only need to last about an hour in order to last till the end of Shabbos. It's a big chiddush to say that the Rambam would hold that would still be asmi doraisa. Again, to last for an hour or so just till the end of Shabbos is a big chiddush, and it seems from Yud Aleph Halacha Tes Vav when he quotes this concept of miskayim, he never mentions the time limit of it being sufficient till the end of Shabbos. That's one argument, and the second argument that he argues on the Minchas Yitzchak, which makes a lot of sense, is that no one would ever write something significant with ink that will disappear. It's true that we try to find the shtick to keeping Shabbos, but no one actually disappearing ink is not a normal significant amount of time for people to actually generally write. So that would suffice for the Rashba, who says it needs to be for a significant, useful amount of time. So for the Rashba, it would not be a problem midoraisa. And again, he quotes from other Rambams. If you look at Yud Aleph Halacha Tes Zayin, it seems from the Rambam himself that it needs to last even more than just Shabbos, because the Rambam in Halacha Tes Zayin, which we don't need to read inside, he mentions writing on skin. The reason, he says, writing on skin would be usser even though your body heat will erase it. And he discusses and he kind of has to answer for why it's not fully miskayim. Because your body heat's going to erase it, but he said but he gets out of the issue of body heat erasing it because it's not relevant, because it's like a koach sheni, it's a separate thing that's going to erase it, but really the writing is still significant. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman points out one's body heat only erases something after a long period of time, after a few days, definitely not after one day of Shabbos. So that the Rambam quotes this and assumes that body heat erasing something would be considered not miskayim. Therefore, the Rambam must hold that miskayim means longer than just Shabbos itself, which I think is very compelling within the Rambam. Again, Rosh Shlomo Zalman quotes that in his Tshuva as well, and you could look at it on page 4 of these Mar Makomos. So for these reasons, and others, the Rosh Shlomo Zalman says that disappearing ink will be only midrabanan. And again, he mentions it not being in Hebrew as a potential sniff, and if it's in Hebrew, it being in script, as other ways to say that disappearing ink will be only an iser derabanan. So that's a good way to, according to Rosh Shlomo Zalman, it's a good way to bump it down. It's a good eitzah to bump it down if you could get this sewing pen or whatever it is. Although a few important caveats to these shticks is that it's unclear to me how helpful it's been. There's been a lot of different discussions about how useful their Shab 8 is. Various different times have been recorded of disappearance. Some people have said I know the previous Einstein rabbi, Rabbi Steinmetz, said that he knows someone who used it who it just disappeared before the end of Shabbos, and that was a big problem because obviously they lost everything. Um, and there's a concern for certain errors and also some people said it worked too well and it never actually disappeared. So you have to look at these specific things again on this link that I saw online that the JPN put out. It seems great, but again, I just looked at some of the reviews today, and some people said. Again, I didn't see any reviews that were talking about Hilchos Shabbos, but some people said be careful because it disappears really, really quickly. So if you're doing that early in the morning on Shabbos and it's a summer Shabbos like now, and you need it to last 14 hours to take it down, that might be a big issue. So it's important just the mitzias there, and obviously losing some of these important essential things that you would need would not be an option. And for sure, if it would compromise patient care, one should be very, very careful about these disappearing inks and should definitely do research and try it out before actually using these things. Although this could potentially be an eitzah that, again, according to Shlomo Zalman, would be a good way of knocking it down from the Araisa. Although it is important, the author of Shemir Shma, the Nishmas Avram quotes of Neworth that perhaps Rosh Hashanah was more machmir later in his life, but on these, but it would seem for all the reasons that Rosh Hashanah said that this is a compelling svara to make it the Rabbanan. So for some. Okay, so that's the disappearing ink. But the more common thing for sure now is computer writing. So what about writing on a computer? What is the status of writing on a computer on Shabbos? So first of all, we'll just go with one approach. It is Machlokas HaPoskin, the Shevet HaLevi. Rav Vosner holds that writing on a computer or taking down something on a computer would be Aser Midoraisa. Would still be Aser Midoraisa. And again, this gets into EMR or taking down any notes when someone does rounds. I discussed a lot of these specific things and what exactly has digital versus physical. I discussed a lot of these things with my brother-in-law, Dr. Shalom Rosenbaum, who's an internal medicine resident at Jacobi Hospital, and we discussed the different things in Jacobi of what things are digital, what things are physical. It seems like death notes are digital, are fully digital now. AMA notices, which hopefully we'll get back to in a minute, are physical there, which obviously leads to a big issue. AMA being against medical advice notices, patient consent forms. They're half digital, half writing. So again, it depends on the hospital, what's digital, what's not. But more and more things are becoming digital for sure. Death notes is a big one. But for sure, when someone's rounding, a lot of people mention when they do rounds, and aside from the EMR, someone might want to take personal notes that they would need to take down for their patients that are essential things that they need to remember. So what about taking along? So we obviously mentioned if you need to write using a shinoi, but what about taking along a phone and writing in a certain app? Obviously, being compliant with HIPAA or all the other regulations. But from what I understand, in many hospital settings, you would be able to use a phone or a tablet or something to take your personal notes that you would need during your morning rounds, for example, in the hospital. So what's the deal with writing on a computer, a tablet, a phone, things like that? Would that be considered Kosev? Would it not? And it's a good question to ask. Is that considered miskayim when I type on a computer or when I type on my phone or my tablet or any of those things? Would that be considered miskayim? So the Shevet HaLevi, Rav Vosner, says yes, it would be. Because again, we're not going to read it inside, but you could look at it on page 5. He says because it would be permanent enough when someone writes it down to be useful, and therefore it is considered miskayim. So it would be good writing for Shabbos because it's useful, and he understands that way. And a fascinating approach that he gives. Is it considered miskayim? It goes right away. It goes away right away because I'm going to switch to another page, or my phone could turn off, or even a screensaver could go on, or any of those things. So what about the fact that it's not miskayim because it could go away, and the writing that I'm putting on this computer right there isn't actually gonna last even for a few days. It's not gonna last. So he mentions that's not really a problem because the fact that it'll go away is really an external factor. When you write, it's permanent. When you write on a computer, it's permanent. The fact that it gets erased for some reasons, you switch off the page or anything else, that's an external factor which doesn't necessarily indicate a lack of miskayim in the initial writing. So when you wrote it initially, it was considered miskayim. So it's like a new eraser coming in, which is a fascinating approach. It's difficult to understand because lemaisa, the way that this is set up, is certainly that um, it's not supposed to be there for a long time, but that gets into a machlokas, which hopefully we'll get back to, between the Ramah and the Lavush of what your original intent is. The Ramah seems to say that if you don't intend on the writing being there permanently, even though it theoretically could be, then that would be halachically significant, and it wouldn't be considered miskayim. But this is the Shevet Alevi's approach, and he holds writing on a computer would be asimi d'oraisa. However, it seems the other poskim and the majority of poskim do not agree that writing on a computer, again, much more very important prerequisite to this that I forgot to mention is that obviously a computer, phone, tablet, all these things, EMR, whatever, is all under the guise of, is all obviously electronic, which gets into the discussion of electricity, which we're not getting too deep into, but obviously all these things are using electricity. Chazon Ish says using electricity in general is asmi d'oraisa, but Rav Shlomo Zalman holds its d'Rabbanan. Even Rav Asher Weiss, who does agree, who does think that using electricity is asmi d'oraisa, says that physicians could rely on the idea that it's d'Rabbanan, and assuming that electricity is d'Rabbanan, and we're not, and we're relying on Rav Shlomo Zalman and others who hold that electricity is d'Rabbanan. So now, what do we do with Kosev? That's really where the discussion goes to, and Rav Shlomo Zalman holds that it would be d'Rabbanan for a number of reasons. First of all, first and foremost, perhaps the most intuitive understanding is that the letters produced on a screen are not actually there. They're not actually tangible. It's an intangible digital representation of letters. They're only tiny dots or pixels which are being emitted at high speeds. The letters, again, Kosev is writing letters that are there, that are physically there. But the pixels are not a single image, and it's just, again, tiny dots flickering. And even though we can't necessarily see it to the naked eye, the letters are not there when you're writing on a computer, and that's pretty significant. Also, and that's and Rav Shlomo Zalman mentions that. Also, another svara to say it's d'Rabbanan, and really the Yabia Omer quotes this as well that I put on the sheet that you can see inside. He says towards the end of page 5, the third to last source on page 5, typing on a computer is not aser kemin she'ena osios madvisos al davar miskayim. He says another thing, that when you type, the letters are not on something that's miskayim, are not on a material that's miskayim, that's permanent. Ela shenirim al masacha machshev bilvad. It's not actually, again, it's not actually there. It's just represented there, but there's nothing actually there. It only and it only really exists as long as the electric current is running, and the image itself is going to go away when I change the screen, as we mentioned already. And again, it's not similar. And another, as far as it's not similar to the paradigmatic writing in the Mishkan. Obviously, that, as we mentioned, was written on the pillars in the Mishkan. The letters were set in place and they were immobile. And in contrast, very, very much so, on our phones, tablets, computers, letters on a computer screen could be moved around, and they're not set. They're not permanent in any way. Also, we mentioned the machlokas. They're not meant to. No one intends for it to be there permanently. And that's really a machlokas Ramah and Lavush. But if you assume, like the Ramah, that your initial intent matters, then that would be another sniff, perhaps, to say it was the Rabbanan. But really, the most common point quoted is that the letters are not constantly illuminated, but just flashing at speeds, like we mentioned, and therefore would be Drabanan. Obviously, there are some who mention, which I do understand, that this point about how it's not actually there, it's just flashing at different speeds and the pixels, and it's really just little dots flashing, and it's not real writing. Some point out that it's really inconsequential because we perceive it as being there, and that's all that should matter. But nevertheless, for sure, if you use the screensaver and it's built into the system that the letters are going to go away, it seems that it being Drabanan makes a lot of sense. Rav Ribiat in the third Nine Malachos on page 953 points this out as well, that that writing on a computer would be difficult to call Kosev. Again, it's obviously electricity. That's important to note, which obviously is usher always, not for medical professionals, but for regular people in regular situations, using electricity is a non-starter. But is it an issue of Kosev? He says he seems to say no, and the only thing that is mentioned as potentially being an issur d'oraisa by both Rav Shlomo Zalman, quoted in the Nishmas Avram. Nishmas Avram has a whole piece about this, as well as Rav Avadia, that it might be an Isser of Bona Midoraisa. It might be the Isser. What would be an Isser of Bona? To use one of these floppy disks or diskettes or any of these chips or things that they had back in the day that aren't really used anymore, because you're turning this floppy disk from an empty, useless item into something that's useful because you're putting information onto it. So maybe it would be considered a case of Bona, and the Shmir Shabbos quotes it as well, that it might be an Isser of Bona. However, nowadays when it goes onto a cloud or the EMR or any of these systems, and it's not on a physical CD or anything like that, then and the information is really stored maybe in silicone chips, but it's really just on a cloud or something, and it needs to be further understood exactly how. But there's no really physical manifestation of it as opposed to perhaps a CD, then a CD or something like that. Then it would seem to not be necessarily an issur of bona in the same way, midoraisa, the way that Rav Avadia and the Shmir Shabbos understood this. And even if, and it seems to even be machlokas there. Again, Rav Rabbi points out that that anything that is stored maybe is unintelligible, uninterpretable, electrical impulses for sure now, and there's no inscriptions or anything that's being stored now, so it wouldn't necessarily be an isser for sure midoraisa bona. You could understand maybe it being a drabanan level. But the issue d'oraisa of being bona seems to be outdated. They mentioned Palm Pilots as well, which might be an issue of bona midoraisa, and if you even if you get around the Kosev issue by being on a computer, so therefore we could get out of bona. So and for sure, even the Chazon Ish, the Rav Shlomo Zalman seems to indicate that even the Chazon Ish would not consider pressing a key to be an issue midoraisa. The Chazon Ish who held the electricity was doraisa if the computer is already on. If the computer is already on, perhaps that even the Chazon Ish would agree that we're only dealing with the Rabbanans turning on the computer, and other things might be doraisa, but just depressing a key may not even be an issur doraisa for the Chazon Ish. So all this being said, so just to get into some of the practical cases. So what's the ideal form of going about this? If I had to write or had to do something, it seems, based on everything we just said, that typing is by far the best halachically. Typing as opposed to writing with a shinoi or even writing with a disappearing pen, which is better than writing with a shinoi. You could write with a shinoi with a disappearing pen. Again, we always try to bump it down more and more. If you need to write with your hand physically, then best to write with a disappearing pen. If you need to write without a disappearing pen, or you don't have a disappearing pen, because and again they're probably becoming obsolete in some way, at least that Shab 8 is, then writing with shinoi. But typing, because it might not even be Kosev at all. It might be an issue of electricity. It might not even be Kosev. Again, using a shinoi for writing would be just a doraisa with a shinoi, but typing on a computer seems to not be Kosev in any way. It would just be the issue of electricity. So it seems typing is the best halachically. So if you had to do rounds, or you had to do anything else, and you could use a phone, tablet, etc., or you have to sign a consent form or anything like that, and it could be on a tablet, that seems to always be better on Shabbos for sure. And then even doing that with a shinoi would be even better. Again, we always try to be mashana. Using that with a shinoi would be even better. So if you could do it, again, using with your left hand, we seem to type with both our right and left. So your left hand probably won't work for typing, but typing with the back of your hand or with your elbow or something like that, or clicking a button with your elbow, again, assuming it doesn't compromise patient care and you get things correctly, that would be even better. I know the GPN mentioned typing with a thimble like the thing you use for sewing. I'm not sure if that, like, how useful that would be or whether that would work, but that also seemingly would be a mahalach. But yeah, digital writing is better than writing with a shinoi, and even better, it seems, than discussing this today with Rav Sobolovsky, it seems that would even be better than using a disappearing pen, because again, disappearing pen is dealing with the doraisa issue with Kosev, but bumping it down through the Rabbanan, whereas this on a computer, according to the most poskim, it seems would not even be an issue of Kosev at all. So that seems to be the levels of what would be ideal in that order. And then just for some of the practical ramifications of that, first of all, we have discharge letters, which is a big discussion because obviously discharging someone, they're no longer sick. So it seems to be, and again, you have to go back to our earlier share number two, on the types of illnesses and what could be done for different people. But the postscript points out, the Nishmas Avram points out that you can't just fill out a discharge notice for someone on Shabbos. Again, one has to remember always that it's Shabbos in the hospital. The only problem, which is understandable, of using the classical EMR or all the other things you do during the week, is that you might forget that it's not Shabbos. As opposed to using a Shab 8, you would realize I'm using this weird pen. You would realize that it's Shabbos. And again, psychologically, it's very important. This is something we mentioned in early sharing, but it's something to constantly reiterate for sure for new residents. Is that when you're in the hospital on Shabbos, you have to constantly remind yourself that it's Shabbos, because there are a lot of situations where you'd be able to bump something down to a shinoi, to a derabanan, or in different cases. I was just speaking to someone who's starting residency, that the way that they start their day in the hospital, if they have to get up to the fourth, fifth floor, of going up the stairs and not using the elevator and constantly being in the mode that it's Shabbos. Again, not compromising patient care in any way, shape, or form, but the things that can be done, the things that can be pressed with an elbow, or the things that can be done with a shinoi, or the things that would be easy to ask a non-Judah perform. All those things we have to constantly reiterate what Shabbos is. That's why it is a good idea when you have to type or you have to do anything like that, to use the back of your hand, or always use a shinoi just to remind yourself. So back to discharge letters. Again, not everything's mutter in a hospital. It seems like there's no heter to write discharge letters, even if it was on a tablet or something like that, to be discharged isn't a tzorech for the chole necessarily. There might have been a discussion during COVID. It might be a dangerous place to be in the hospital, but in most situations for a patient, it might not be so simple for the physician to write a discharge letter. However, the Nishmas Avram points out that when it would perhaps be mutter to violate Amira or violate the Rabbanan, at least, is if the hospital is at capacity, and then this room and this area and this place could be used for, or will for sure be used for someone else, and you would replace someone quickly, and therefore it would be a tzorech for the new. And this is the last source on the page. That this is the last source on the page, that the Rosh Hashanah told Dr. Abraham, "V'chein amar li ha'gaon Rosh Hashanah, she'im yesh tzrifus b'cheder miyun v'ze'ol ligrom tzar l'rabim." Then it would be mutter. If it would lead to tsar for Rabin, for a lot of people waiting even longer to be seen, which again is directly impacting a chola, then it might be mutter. So it really depends on the metzias. It depends on the situation. A lot of our hospitals in nearby, at least in town, it does seem in many situations, for sure during COVID or during peak times, that the metzias is not that it takes a few hours, but it takes right away. When someone's discharged, another person just takes his place. Because a lot of hospitals are just at capacity, for sure in the ER, or other places they're just at capacity. So if you have electricity plus, so again, so to write a discharge letter, if this is true, but if this is true, that we know that someone would immediately come in and that room could be used immediately for a new chole sheyesh bo sakana, or even chole she'ein bo sakana, then there will be a lot more heterim. But if you know this room won't be used for another hour, two, three, whatever, then it seems that there wouldn't be the same heter. So if you use electricity for discharge letter plus the shinoi, which is always great to do, again to sign with the back of your finger or whatever on the tablet, plus a chola waiting, that would all be a heter perhaps to write a discharge letter. Again, digitally makes things better. That would be a potential heter. Death notes are another point. Obviously, death notes, by definition, you're not saving a patient because this patient is no longer alive. So there's really very few heterim. There's really no heter to write a death note. I know that Rav Neuberger uses this as the example of someone who is in the hospital on Shabbos, that the example of being able to overcome, being able to be omed b'ni sayun in order to fulfill your task, being able to not sign a death note seems to be a non-starter, because again, a death note, the person is not alive, you're not dealing with patient care. You might have to, for other reasons, it might be policy, whatever, but you're not actually dealing with the chola. You're not dealing with helping anyone. You're just dealing with signing their death note. Although, if it would lead, the Nishmas Avram does point out, quoting the Shmir Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah, that if it would lead to delay in burial and disrespect to the dead person, then maybe you could violate Amir La'akum, or certain Derabanans, and um, so maybe you could violate Amira, but in order for sure, if it was a physical death note, that would be a non-starter. And you could look in the Nishmas Avram uh, for in Siman Shin Mem, uh, uh, Sifkat and Dalid, in order to see more on that. But it would seem that there really is no heter for death notes in general. Again, unless it would really lead to a disrespect and burial or whatever, but push that off on someone else seems to be the best mahalach. And again, really try to avoid. Really, that should be avoided. And for sure, to write, there would be no heter whatsoever for death notes. The final thing, sorry, there's the few other things I will mention quickly is the surgical consent form I mentioned before. Again, the gradations of what to do. If it depends, some places are physical, some are digital. Digital is obviously better if you need to do physically. And again, this needs to be done. It's a chol sheyesh bo sakana, then the left hand for sure. I also had a thought. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear feedback on this. If it's talking about a signature, oftentimes signatures, no one actually gives like a signature at the supermarket or whatever. You could just do a squiggly line. So as we mentioned, the real Isser Da'areisa of Kosev would be two letters. So if you just do a squiggly line or something, again, I certainly don't. No one should get in trouble. Everyone should do things that are according to the rules, but assuming that you do that in general when you have to sign a form or something, you just do a squiggly line or something, then l'chora, that would be another heter when you have to sign your name or something like that, to just do a squiggly line that doesn't actually represent one or even two letters, which seems to be a general approach to signing one's name. Then perhaps that would be an additional heter, but for sure left hand, and if it's digitally, back of the hand, whatever it is, surgical consent form. But obviously, a lot of those are cases where you have to. An AMA form against medical advice seems to be not a heter to write for, just because even if it's digital and you're dealing with the Rabbanans, someone who's just not following medical advice, you're no longer treating them. It's just really for insurance or other things. That this would have to be signed. So it seems to be there's no heter to sign a AMA form. And from what my brother-in-law told me, the AMA forms are physical. So for you, the physician, to sign a physical form that's not actually dealing with patient care seems to be a non-starter. That would be a problem. And apparently it's not illegal to walk out without an AMA. It just leads to some problems, but it's not illegal. So for sure, as a physician, that should be avoided. And and the very last concept in Kosev is printing. Everyone seems to agree. A lot of the poskim seem to agree that printing itself is asur d'oraisa. So if something needed to be printed, and that's the general approach, again, if it's a chol sheyesh bo sakana and something needs to be printed, and consent forms, for example, are always printed, try not to be the one who obviously does it, because most people say it is asur midoraisa. The Shmir Shabbos points that out, Nishmas Avram points that out. Rav Rabbi points that out, that it is ksiva d'oraisa, because this is the normal way that you write in that way. To print is the standard way of writing, because that is the way to do it. So, however, if you had to print and there was no other way to do it, and it was a chol sheyesh bo sakana, and someone who you needed to print for, then for sure you should use a shinoi in printing. And again, clicking the print button with your left hand seemingly would not work. But if you do it with your nose, your elbow, the back of your hand, something like that, something that's strange, that would be better. Again, to bump it down to a drabanan. Although it's an important thing to note, although this does not seem to be agreed to by the poskim at all, Rav Moshe seems to indicate in Tchumen, in volume 4, page 423, Rav Moshe seems to indicate it wasn't exactly printing, but it seems to be the same type of case. It was about sort of printing out labels, that printing would not necessarily be asur midoraisa, because when you print, it's not actually writing by the maisa of the person. You're just causing the computer to print. You're causing the computer to write, and this gets into a much broader topic of grama and what exactly it means to do grama, and what causes grama, which means it was indirectly caused. it would be a malacha that's not directly caused by me. And this really gets into a broader discussion. What would that be? Is grama a function of time? The fact that it didn't happen right away? What if I was fifth on the line of printing and there are a lot of other things that are being printed and and I click the button, but it's only being printed in 5 minutes? Would that also be grama because it's a function of time? Or perhaps grama is a function just of my action and it's about whether I directly cause it. So even if it's happening in a few minutes, it's directly caused by me. So this gets into a broader discussion, although Rav Moshe seems to indicate that it would only be aser midrabanan because it's not directly my sen. He mentions that it's only my koach sheni. It's not my koach, but it's the koach of the computer, which I'm causing to then write, but it's a computer writing. So perhaps in cases of necessity, again, shinoi should always be used. And for sure, again, you don't have to write, you just have to click it. For sure, any time that you might have to print, again, according to almost all the poskim, it seems to be also midoraisa. It should only be used really with a shinoi if it needs to for chol hashish pusakana or other things. And in our earlier shir about exactly what could be done for a different cholim. But this is important Rav Moshe to a back pocket Rav Moshe that it seems to be that according to Rav Moshe at least again in Das Yachid here that printing might be aser midrabanan. And for all these things that I mentioned before, please follow up with a posik. Please follow up in individual circumstance and individual cases, especially the cases that we mentioned before applying it always in the field. And yeah, we should continue to keep Shabbos and to give the best possible care to our patients. Have a great night.